Hello, my dear friends. I hope everyone is well. As you can see, I'm out on my porch because the spring has arrived, and there's the miracle that takes place every spring, and that is the trees, the grass, the lawn, the foliage, during the winter, they look like they were dead, and suddenly they spring back to life. It's mamish nes. I want to talk about anger this week for two reasons. First, because the Parsha discusses anger. Moshe Rabbeinu became angry. Vayiksuf Moshe, the Torah says. He was angry at his brother Aharon and his children Elazar and Isamar, because this was after Aaron's children, Nadav and Avihu, passed away. And Aaron made a decision to burn a certain korban, a korban chatas, that was brought on Rosh Chodesh, and he had a halachic justification, and Moshe disagreed. And because he didn't think that they did the right thing, so he was angry at them for having made that decision. Chazal say that Moshe was in fact not correct. His brother and his nephews did the right thing. And the Gemara attributes it to that he made a mistake in halacha because he became angry. He was koas, he became angry, and halacha was hidden from him. He did not remember the proper halacha. And the Gemara says that this happened 2 other times, that Moshe was angry, v'nis alma mimeno halacha. Why is it that anger, and I'll tell you the second reason in a moment why I want to talk about anger. But first, let me explain, what's the connection between anger and remembering halachas? I think the answer is because Moshe Rabbeinu had a grasp of the entire Torah. He remembered every single detail. And that's because he had a neshama that was so tremendously refined and so divinely inspired that's why he was able to remember, because Torah is God-given, and he was able to relate to every single detail of Torah and not forget it. But the Zohar says that when a person becomes angry, they lose their neshama, which is to say, every person has a tzelem Elokim. There's a godly image within the person. You could see it on people's faces. Everybody has a certain godly countenance. Great people have a greater hadrus panim, divine countenance. But everybody has human beings don't look the same as animals. But when a person becomes angry, their countenance changes, and that's a mirror into what's going on inside their neshama. The neshama is compromised when a person is angry. Person, the expression we say, he lost it or she lost it when they got angry. What they're losing is their own humanity. They're losing their neshama. They're losing the tzelem Elokim, the divine spark. So Moshe Rabbeinu, when he became angry, was not the same Moshe Rabbeinu as he was a moment before. The great Moshe Rabbeinu was able to remember all of Torah, but once his neshama was ever so slightly compromised, and the fact is that Moshe was entitled to be angry in all 3 instances, but nonetheless, that's what Rav Chaim Shmulevitz points out, but nonetheless, he even though he was right, justified, but he didn't have a right to become angry. The anger is never justified. The Rambam says that even in situations where a person feels it's important to display anger, it should not be authentic. It shouldn't be emotional. It should be feigned. It should be, a person has to put on a good show and make believe they're angry, but it should not be authentic anger. And Moshe Rabbeinu became truly angry by Yiksuf Moshe, and because of that, there was some impact on his neshama, at least momentarily, and therefore was nesalman mimena halacha, and he forgot the halachas. And if Moshe Rabbeinu, who spoke directly to Kadosh Baruch Hu, can be affected by anger in such a profound way, certainly the rest of us mortals have to be concerned about the impact that anger has upon us. The second reason why I want to talk about anger is because our society is off the charts when it comes to anger. People are so upset about so many things. There's so much acrimony and hatred. In the political world, there's this tremendous divide, partisanship, and politicians are busy mudslinging all day long when they're not campaigning, and they express enormous anger to each other. and it's pervasive in society, and that's perhaps one of the reasons why we're witnessing terrorist attacks and mass murders, which never happened years ago. I don't remember before Columbine. I don't recall such things ever happening, but it's because we're living in an angry society. People are just so full of hatred, and it's reflected in the lack of tolerance. When a person is angry, they're not interested in hearing the other person's position. I saw a beautiful quote on the internet. I don't remember who said it, but the person said, anger is unquestionably the most moralistic of emotions. That is, angry people almost always experience their anger as fully justified, that they're clearly in the right about whatever they're upset about, as if God himself came down and taught them the truth. So when people feel that way, so they become intolerant, because after all, it's an outrage what the other person said and what the other person's doing and the other person feels, and I know I'm right and they are wrong. So how do we deal with anger? It's a bad thing. We all know that it's not good. Anger has terrible consequences. It's like shooting oneself in the foot. It destroys relationships, family relationships, spousal relationships, parents and children. It destroys friendships, and it also jeopardizes a person's success in the workforce, because nobody wants to work with a person who is always angry. And people lose respect for angry people. They even if they don't know what the Zohar says, that when you're angry, your neshama departs, but they see the change that takes place in the person's personality, in the person's countenance, and they lose respect. And so when a person gets angry, essentially what the person is doing is shooting himself or herself in the foot. Nonetheless, anger is very difficult to control, and in order to do so, one really has to prepare in advance. If you try to control the anger after you're angry, it's almost impossible. It has to be controlled before the adrenaline starts rushing, and before you start on a passionate tirade and say how this is terrible. It has to be nipped in the bud. Ramosha Feinstein said that he was by nature a very passionate person, and he spent years working on his emotions to control them. And indeed, there's a lot of stories about Ramosha that reflect how successful he was in doing so. Ramosha, was the great posek of our times. There's a beautiful story. Ramosha, after the war, purchased the Vilna Shas. Vilna is a certain printing of the Shas. Well, it's the name of a city, but it refers to a printing of the Shas that originally came from Vilna. He spent $200, which at that time was a month's salary. So it was a very precious commodity. And Ramosha was studying with the Shas. He had one volume of the Shas in his study on the table, and he had an inkwell next to the Shas. In those days, they wrote with quills. He walked out of the room, or not with quills necessarily, but with fountain pens. He walked out of the room for a moment, and of course, you know what happened. A student came in, and he accidentally tipped the ink over the Gemara. The student was petrified. Ramosha came back into the room. He saw the student's face, and then he saw the Gemara, and he understood immediately what had transpired. So Ramosha immediately said, "Oh, wow, I love the way the Shas looks with the blue color." He said that to the Talmud. Look at the beautiful blue color that you made for my Shas. And that's a person who's in control of his emotions. Revelia Lapian, who was a great mashkiach who lived in Eretz Yisrael, a great Baal Musar, said he never gave Musar immediately. He always waited until there was some calming period. He would wait overnight or wait a few days, because he didn't want to be angry when he was giving people Musar. He one time was upset with his son. He waited 2 weeks to reprimand his son because he wanted to wait until the anger dissipated. Rav Simcha Zissel was the mashgiach in Kelm. He was known as the Alter from Kelm, and he had a special suit that he wore whenever he became angry. He didn't allow himself. He had made a pact with himself that he wasn't going to allow himself to become angry while he was wearing, until he wore that suit. So naturally, when he felt the urge to be angry, he had to go to his room and take out the suit from the closet and change. By the time all that transpired, he realized how foolish it was to be angry, and the anger had already dissipated. Ram tells a beautiful story. Anger needs to be viewed as an assignment. It's a test from God. So the person who has a tendency to get angry has to realize that it's not real. What I said before, that anger is a moralistic emotion. The person has to recognize that just because he's angry doesn't mean that he's right, or even if he is right. But the anger is uncalled for, and a person has to realize that God is testing us with when it comes to anger. Rav Pam tells the story. There was somebody by the name of Rav Mordechai who bought some very expensive fabric, and he gave it to a tailor to make him a pair of tzitzis. And he was waiting and waiting, and the tailor never got back to him. So finally he went to the tailor shop, and he asked him what happened to my tzitzis. So the tailor said, I'm so embarrassed. I made a mistake. I cut out a hole in the talus for where you would put the talus over your head, but accidentally I cut out a second hole, and I was embarrassed to tell you that. So Mordechai said right away, he says, well, you're upset. Well, why are you worried? What are you afraid of? He said, that's great, because I needed one hole for my head and the other hole for the anger to escape. You know the famous story of the Chernobyl Rabbi, Rabbi from Chernobyl. He had a pair of tefillin that he inherited from his father that belonged to the Baal Shem Tov. Came Erev Sukkot, he didn't have a Luban esrog, and somebody came to town with a beautiful Luban esrog, but it was very expensive. So he pawned off his tefillin, and he used the money to buy a Luban esrog. When he came home, his wife saw they had this beautiful esrog, and she said to her husband, she said, we don't have any, we don't even have money to buy food for the kids. How could you have afforded such a beautiful esrog? So he said, well, I sold the tefillin that I had, which was his most precious possession. So she was so angry. She said, we don't have clothing for the children. We don't have food. And you took something that was the greatest treasure that you had, and you sold it for an esrog. And she took the esrog. Some say she bit off the pitim. Some say she threw it to the floor and the pitim fell off. Either way, so Rav Nachum said, now I don't have I lost my tefillin, and I also lost my esrog, but I'm not going to lose my temper. So these are people that recognize that anger is a test from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and it has to be controlled. The Gemara says that there's three ways that you can judge a person. You can know what type of person they are. Bikiso, Bikoso, Uvakaso. Bikiso is one's purse. How does one spend money? Are they selfish? Are they self-centered? Bikoso is what happens to a person when they imbibe. People disgrace themselves oftentimes when they become intoxicated. And finally, it's Bikaso. It's when the person becomes angry, because that demonstrates how much self-control they have and how many times they allow their neshama to depart, and they go on raging campaigns because they can't control their anger. So the lesson here is, if Moshe Rabbeinu, who was the greatest leader of all times, was guilty 3 times in his lifetime of losing his temper, then we certainly need to worry about losing our temper. And we should not allow ourselves to be swept away in the tidal wave of rage and anger and hostility and acrimony that prevails in society. But if we want to control our anger, it's not something that we could just roll out of bed and say, okay, from now on I won't get angry. It requires a great deal of contemplation, a great deal of work, but it's well worth the effort, because When we get angry, we are hurting ourselves. And if we can control our anger, so then the tzelem that Elohim, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has granted us, will remain with us always.